Dutch van der Linde's downfall in Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't sudden. It's a slow unraveling built on pride, paranoia, and the crushing weight of failure. At the beginning, Dutch is magnetic. He believes in freedom, in protecting the gang, in giving everyone a better life. For Arthur and John, he's more than a leader. He's almost a father. But every choice he makes after the Blackwater ferry robbery begins to expose cracks in that perfect image. The ferry job is where it all starts. Dutch's plan fails, people die, and the gang is forced to flee into the mountains. Instead of admitting he miscalculated, Dutch convinces himself it was just bad luck. That denial sets the stage for everything that follows. When Colm O'Driscoll is caught, Dutch refuses Arthur's plea to end the feud peacefully. Pride won't let him. He can't back down to his rival, even if it puts the gang in danger. In St. Denis, his spiral deepens. The bank heist should have been the moment that saved the gang. Instead, it's a disaster. Hosea, his oldest friend and moral compass, is executed in front of him. You can feel Dutch snap. Losing Hosea means losing the one person who could talk sense into him. From that moment on, Dutch stops listening. His paranoia grows, and he starts pushing away anyone who questions him. On Guarma, his behavior becomes even more erratic. He leads the gang into helping a rebellion, not out of loyalty or principle, but because he wants to prove he's still in control. He starts to confuse recklessness with leadership, and you can see Arthur's trust in him start to crumble. Back in the States, Dutch becomes obsessed with the one last job fantasy. Whether it's the train robbery with Cornwall, the trolley station job, or the attack on the army, every plan gets bigger and riskier. Each time, Dutch insists this will fix everything. But the truth is, he's chasing a dream that's already dead. America is changing. Railroads, oil, and government control are swallowing the outlaw way of life. And Dutch can't accept it. Then there's Micah. Micah feeds Dutch's ego, telling him he's always right, poisoning him against Arthur and John. When Arthur gets sick and starts questioning Dutch's choices, Dutch sees it as betrayal. Instead of valuing Arthur's honesty, he clings to Micah's lies because they let him hold on to his illusion of control. That's why he abandons Arthur on the mountain. Not just because Arthur defied him, but because Arthur reminded him of a truth Dutch couldn't face, that he had lost his way. By the end, Dutch is unrecognizable. The man who once spoke about loyalty sacrifices his family for pride. The man who dreamed of freedom becomes a tyrant in his own gang. His decisions are no longer about survival. They're about proving he was never wrong. And that's what makes his decline so tragic. Dutch isn't just a villain. He's a man destroyed by his own ideals, by his refusal to adapt, and by his fear of being left behind in a world he no longer understands. Dutch's story is a slow collapse, and that's why it hits so hard. You don't just see him fall. You see him lose the trust of the people who loved him most. And in the end, he's left with nothing but empty words and a dream that died long before he did.
Money in Red Dead Redemption 2 is everywhere. In safes, banks, stagecoaches, and in the hands of the rich men Dutch swears he's fighting against. But while players see the gang constantly chasing fortune, the real mystery lies in how they handle money once they have it. And how Dutch's financial mismanagement may have doomed the Van der Linde gang long before the Pinkertons ever closed in. From the very beginning, we see Dutch preaching about freedom from the system. Money is freedom, he says more than once. Yet the way the gang's camp finances work completely contradicts his ideals. Every heist, robbery, or side job goes into a communal lockbox. Arthur keeps meticulous track of contributions, and if you look closely, you can see something odd. Dutch almost never donates. In fact, the ledger shows that most of the gang's wealth comes from Arthur, Hosea, and even lower-ranked members like Charles and Lenny. Dutch takes credit for the money, but rarely adds to the pot himself. It's even stranger when you start examining where the money actually goes. The gang spends large amounts on camp upgrades, ammunition, food, and medicine. But Dutch himself seems to be funding something else entirely. His fine suits, the constant relocation of camps, and expensive luxuries hint at personal indulgence. Notice how, by Chapter 4 in St. Denis, Dutch's lifestyle starts mirroring the very men he despises. He drinks fine wine, dresses in tailored clothes, and mingles with upper-class figures like Angelo Brontë. That shift isn't just symbolic. It's the first sign that Dutch's relationship with money has become an obsession, rather than a tool for freedom. By the time of the St. Denis bank heist, Dutch's decisions around money become reckless. He's no longer thinking like a leader, but like a gambler chasing his losses. Every score is the one that will set us free, but none of it adds up. The gang robs Cornwall, a train tycoon, and yet still has to flee to Guarma with nothing. They return broke and desperate. If you look at the game's dialogue, Arthur and Hosea repeatedly question where the money goes, but Dutch dodges the question every time. Some fans have speculated that Dutch was secretly hoarding gold or making deals with corrupt officials, but there's no solid proof of that. What we do know is that he was losing control of his priorities. Even the donations at camp tell the story of the gang's decline. In the early chapters, Arthur's journal entries show genuine progress. Food, ammunition, morale, all funded through their work. By Chapter 6, the ledger becomes nearly empty. The sense of community that the lockbox represented fades away. When Dutch begins excluding Arthur and siding with Micah, it's as if the money, once shared among family, has become a weapon for manipulation. Dutch uses promises of wealth to control loyalty. There's another layer to this, too. The economy of Red Dead Redemption, to itself mirrors the collapse of the American frontier. Industrialists like Cornwall control oil, railroads, and labor. No matter how much the gang steals, they can never actually win. The world has moved on from men like Dutch and Arthur. The Pinkertons represent corporate law, backed by money and influence, while Dutch is trying to fight that with outdated methods. In a way, his obsession with one last big score is his attempt to buy back a world that no longer exists. What's tragic is that the gang could have survived if they'd just stopped. After the Braithwaite Manor job, Arthur mentions they have enough to live quietly. Even Hosea suggests fleeing south and settling down. But Dutch refuses. The idea of enough doesn't exist for him anymore. His revolution needed constant motion, constant risk.
Dutch van der Linde spends all of Red Dead Redemption 2 talking about freedom, but one of the most fascinating parts of his character is how deeply he fears it. And this is something the game never outright states, but the clues are everywhere if you look. Dutch builds his entire persona on the idea that he's a revolutionary, a man standing against the system. But when you watch how he actually behaves, you realize he's terrified of a world where he isn't the center of attention. What he calls freedom is really control. Control over the gang, over their beliefs, over their future, and especially over the narrative of who he is supposed to be. One of the clearest examples comes from how he treats Arthur as the story progresses. Early on, Dutch values Arthur genuinely. He trusts him, listens to him, even confides in him. But as soon as Arthur begins questioning him when he stops feeding Dutch's ego, Dutch cuts him off emotionally. It's not because Arthur is wrong, it's because Arthur threatens the version of Dutch that Dutch wants everyone to believe in. The collapse of Dutch's ideals doesn't start with the Blackwater Massacre. It starts the moment someone he respects stops believing the story he's been telling. Another detail players often overlook is how Dutch's speeches become more dramatic, as his plans become less grounded in reality. When the gang is thriving early in the game, Dutch barely gives speeches at all. He doesn't need to. The gang trusts him naturally. It's only once everything starts slipping away, once Cornwall, the Pinkertons, and his own poor decisions back him into a corner, that he starts performing. His speeches become longer, louder, more poetic, as if he's trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Dutch starts relying on theatrics because he can no longer rely on results. And then there's Dutch's growing obsession with betrayal.
All right, little feller.
Throughout the game, he repeats one line more than any other. You have to have faith. To Dutch, faith means unconditional loyalty. But the twist is that Dutch himself is the one who betrays the gang long before anyone betrays him. He betrays Hosea by abandoning the gang's principles. He betrays Arthur by refusing to listen when Arthur is trying to save everyone. He betrays John by leaving him for dead, all while claiming the gang betrayed him. Dutch's paranoia is a projection. He sees betrayal everywhere because he feels guilty, even if he'll never admit it. A crucial but quiet turning point is his interaction with Eagle Flies near the end of the game. Dutch uses Eagle Flies the same way he uses his own gang. He promises hope, then sends a young man into danger for his own benefit. Dutch talks about wanting a life where no one controls anyone, but he consistently manipulates the most vulnerable people around him. His downfall isn't caused by external enemies. It's caused by the fact that he cannot exist without followers. The world Dutch claims to want is a world he wouldn't survive in. Finally, one of the most powerful pieces of Dutch's story comes after Arthur's death, when Dutch shows up again in Beaver Hollow during the epilogue. He doesn't give a speech. He doesn't rant about dreams or plans. He's quiet. And that silence speaks louder than any monologue he ever gave. By that point, Dutch knows he destroyed everything he claimed to love. His gang is gone. Hosea is dead. Arthur is dead. John wants nothing to do with him. And the dream he fought for was never real in the first place. Dutch isn't a villain because he's evil. He's a villain because he cannot let go of the idea that he is the hero of his own story. In the end, Dutch is the perfect tragedy of Red Dead Redemption 2. A man who fought the world only to realize he never knew who he was without someone fighting beside him. Dutch van der Linde is one of the most fascinating characters Rockstar has ever written, but there's an angle that rarely gets explored. Dutch's obsession with performance, his need to be seen as a visionary, a philosopher, a leader, even when the reality of his actions is falling apart. Throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, Dutch talks about freedom, loyalty, and a better world. But if you look closely, almost everything he does is about protecting the image he has built, not the ideals he claims to fight for. You can see this in the way he speaks. Long speeches, dramatic pauses, constant references to the plan. Dutch doesn't just want to lead the gang, he wants to be remembered as the great leader of the gang. One of the earliest signs of this is how defensive Dutch becomes whenever anyone challenges him. Arthur asking a simple question can trigger Dutch into giving a 10-minute justification. It's not because Dutch believes he's wrong, it's because he can't allow himself to look unsure. When Hosea starts quietly showing doubt, Dutch distances himself. When Arthur questions his decisions, Dutch attacks his loyalty. And when John tries to leave the criminal lifestyle behind, Dutch frames it as betrayal, not growth. Dutch's worldview requires him to always be the one with the last word, the final answer, the grand plan, even if that plan is crumbling in front of everyone. You can also track Dutch's unraveling through the way he changes his language. Early in the game, he talks about us, family, and doing what's right. After the Blackwater incident and the constant pressure from the Pinkertons, his wording shifts. It becomes I, my plan, my vision. It's a subtle change, but it's deliberate writing from Rockstar. Dutch stops leading a group of people and starts performing for an audience. A shrinking audience, but one he desperately needs to impress. Micah feeds into this perfectly. He tells Dutch exactly what Dutch wants to hear. That he's brilliant, that he's in control, that everyone else is holding him back. Dutch isn't manipulated by Micah because he's weak. Dutch chooses Micah because Micah protects Dutch's ego. Another overlooked detail is Dutch's fear of silence. Throughout the game, Dutch talks more when things are going wrong. When morale is low, he gives speeches. When the gang questions him, he doubles down. When the plan falls apart, Dutch creates a bigger plan to distract everyone, including himself, from the fact that he doesn't actually have a solution. The move to Guarma is the perfect example. It's a ridiculous choice, impulsive and dangerous. But it allows Dutch to keep performing as the man with the answers. Even when he's completely out of options, Dutch acts like a playwright rewriting the story as he goes. The final clue to Dutch's true nature comes in the epilogue. By the time John confronts him on the cliff, Dutch isn't angry or loud anymore. He's quiet, defeated, reflective. For the first time in the story, Dutch isn't performing. He's just a man realizing he destroyed everything he claimed to love. His last line to John and Micah, "I did my best." Dutch van der Linde's mental decline in Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the most compelling and tragic character unravelings in modern gaming. At the start of the story, Dutch still carries much of the charisma, intelligence, and fatherly confidence that made him such a strong leader in the gang's early years. He speaks passionately about freedom, loyalty, and the dream of living outside society's control. But even in those early moments, you can sense cracks beneath the surface. Moments where his pride is a little too fragile, and his decisions a little too impulsive. The failed Blackwater ferry robbery sets the first major fracture, leaving Dutch wounded not physically but psychologically. He begins the game desperate to reassert control, convinced that one more successful score will put everything back in place. Dutch's decline becomes more noticeable as the gang settles in Valentine and later Horseshoe Overlook. He starts making choices driven more by emotion than strategy. While he still presents himself as a thinker, his ability to reason is slipping. The more pressure he feels, mounting Pinkerton pursuit, the weight of providing for the gang, and the guilt he refuses to acknowledge, the more he doubles down on risky ideas. Instead of adjusting to reality, Dutch becomes obsessed with proving he hasn't lost his edge. That stubbornness grows into a dangerous blend of ego and paranoia, pushing him into actions that someone in full control of his mind would never consider. One of the clearest moments showing Dutch's unraveling is the situation with the Greys and Braithwaites. He convinces himself that he can manipulate two feuding families, believing he's still the master chess player he once was. But instead of outsmarting anyone, he leads the gang into tragedy, failing to see traps that would have been obvious to the Dutch of years past. The abduction of Jack, one of the most emotional moments in the game, happens because Dutch misjudges the situation entirely. Rather than reflect on what he missed, he reacts with fury, masking insecurity with bravado. Every failure feeds into his need to blame someone else instead of confronting the very real decline happening inside him. As the story moves into St. Denis, Dutch's instability skyrockets. His reliance on people like Angelo Brontë shows how desperate he's become. He allows himself to be manipulated, humiliated, and then lashes out violently in response. His drowning of Brontë is the breaking point for many gang members. That moment isn't the action of a strong, composed leader. It's the impulsive revenge of a man whose grip on his own identity is slipping. Arthur, who once admired Dutch above anyone else, sees firsthand how Dutch is no longer guided by ideals. He's now guided by fear, pride, and the determination to appear unbroken at any cost. Guarma pushes Dutch into an even darker place. Isolated from familiar surroundings and forced into survival mode, his paranoia intensifies. Real or imagined threats begin to blend together, and he starts interpreting even the actions of loyal gang members as challenges to his authority. His relationship with Arthur deteriorates rapidly because Arthur sees truths Dutch refuses to face. Instead of acknowledging his mistakes, Dutch grows more erratic and more accusatory. He clings to Micah Bell, exactly the type of person he would have despised in earlier years, because Micah feeds his ego and validates his increasingly distorted worldview. By the time the gang reaches Beaver Hollow, Dutch is a shadow of his former self. His iconic speeches no longer inspire, they feel hollow, repetitive, and desperate. Arthur and others begin noticing that Dutch lies easily, even casually, something the early Dutch rarely did. His decisions become more violent and less strategic. The plan with the army, the dynamite, the robbery ideas that no longer make sense, all reflect a man spiraling into delusion. He stops caring about the people he once called family. He stops caring about loyalty unless it benefits him. He becomes willing to sacrifice the very gang he once protected with everything he had. The height of Dutch's decline comes in his refusal to rescue John during the train heist, and later when he outright abandons Arthur on the mountainside. These moments show Dutch's mind fully fracturing. He's no longer driven by dreams of freedom. He's driven by prideful survival. Losing control terrifies him so much that he'd rather let loyal friends die than admit he was wrong. His trust in Micah, the whispers in the gang, and the paranoia of being betrayed all merge into one final collapse of the man he once was. Yet Dutch's decline isn't simple villainy. It's a tragedy. He wasn't always like this. The game hints at a long past of trauma, loss, and overwhelming responsibility. He carried the burden of leading a gang that depended entirely on him, and the world around him was changing faster than he could adapt. Dutch wasn't built for that kind of pressure, and instead of evolving, he broke under it. His downfall is the fall of an idealist who couldn't face his own humanity. Dutch van der Linde begins Red Dead Redemption 2 as a man who genuinely believes in something bigger than himself. He's charismatic, eloquent, and magnetic, the kind of leader people want to follow. His dream, at least at the outset, seems almost noble: to live free outside the reach of a society that's tightening its grip on the frontier. Dutch preaches freedom, justice, and resistance against oppression, portraying his life of crime as a necessary pushback against corporations, lawmen, and the forces of modernization that he believes are destroying the old way of life. This idea attracts a motley crew of outcasts, orphans, and dreamers who come to see him as a father figure and protector. For a time, Dutch's leadership works. The van der Linde gang survives, they pull off daring heists, and they share moments of genuine camaraderie. But even before the events of the game fully unfold, there are early signs that Dutch's utopia is more rhetoric than reality. His tendency to dominate conversations, his intolerance of dissent, and how he frames any question about his decisions as betrayal hint at a darker core beneath the idealism. In practice, his philosophy often serves as an excuse for violence and criminality rather than a true moral compass. As RDR2 progresses, the pressures of constant pursuit by law enforcement, the disastrous Blackwater robbery, and repeated setbacks strain Dutch's psyche. External stressors aren't the only force at work, though. Internal influences matter too. Bell, a new member of the gang with a ruthless and self-serving personality, begins to worm his way into Dutch's confidence, feeding his paranoia and encouraging more extreme behavior. Dutch's reliance on Micah marks a turning point, where once he listened to trusted advisors like Hosea Matthews and Arthur Morgan, now he surrounds himself with those who reaffirm his ego rather than challenge it. Where Dutch once professed to act for the good of his gang and for freedom itself, he gradually shifts towards self-preservation and ego-driven decisions. Missions that should have been tactical retreats or cautious maneuvers turn into acts of vengeance or grandstanding. His speeches, while still eloquent, become increasingly disconnected from reality. What's most tragic is that Dutch still believes he's right, even when his choices put his people who trust him utterly in danger. This unraveling doesn't just affect Dutch, it affects everyone around him. Arthur Morgan, who has spent his whole life devoted to Dutch and the gang, begins to see the cracks in Dutch's philosophy clearly. Arthur's loyalty is challenged not only by the gang's external enemies, but by Dutch's growing instability. Arthur starts to prioritize the safety and future of individuals like John Marston's family over blind loyalty to Dutch's deteriorating vision, a shift that highlights Dutch's decline not just as a leader, but as a moral center. By the later chapters, Dutch's decisions become erratic and increasingly harmful. He abandons plans that would have ensured the gang's escape, and instead chases schemes that serve his ego more than the group's well-being. He even leaves loyal members, like John and Abigail Marston, in dire straits to pursue his own revenge or out of sheer distrust, marking the final stage of his downfall. A leader who no longer leads but fractures. In the concluding moments of RDR2 and continuing into the original Red Dead Redemption, Dutch has transformed almost beyond recognition. Where he was once a visionary, however flawed, he becomes a shadow of himself. Dutch van der Linde begins Red Dead Redemption 2 as more than just an outlaw. He carries a philosophy rooted in freedom, resistance to authority, and a romanticized vision of the Old West. His dream is to escape the encroaching modern world, rejecting government control, railroads, emerging technology, and the social structures that he believes oppress the common man. To Dutch, the Van der Linde gang isn't just a group of criminals. It's a fellowship resisting a system that he sees as unjust and corrupt. This vision is charismatic and compelling, which is why characters like Arthur Morgan, John Marston, and others are drawn to him in the first place. They believe he speaks truth to a world that seems increasingly hostile to independence and freedom. At the start, Dutch's philosophy feels almost noble in its defiance. He speaks of a savage utopia, a place beyond the reach of law and bureaucratic order, where the gang can live free and independent of the powerful institutions shaping the new America. His idealism, while imperfect, gives the gang a sense of purpose beyond simple outlaw survival, and makes him genuinely inspiring. Gang members don't merely follow him because of fear or force, but because they believe, at least initially, that Dutch understands the forces crushing them. However, Dutch's philosophical foundation begins to crumble as the story progresses and reality repeatedly contradicts his ideals. The overwhelming pressure from Pinkertons, failed heists like the one in St. Denis, and mounting losses erode Dutch's ability to uphold his rhetoric with actions. Instead of rallying the gang toward achievable goals, Dutch starts leaning on grandiose speeches and recycled rhetoric. The same speeches that Arthur and others begin to hear over and over again without meaningful progress. Part of this collapse is internal. As external threats mount, Dutch begins to surround himself with voices who reinforce his worldview rather than challenge it, especially Micah Bell. Micah, a manipulative and self-serving sycophant, encourages Dutch's worst tendencies, feeding his insecurity and paranoia. This dynamic pushes Dutch further away from his early vision and deeper into irrational choices that harm the gang more than they help it. Dutch's philosophical unraveling is mirrored in his behavioral shift. Where he once spoke of freedom and mutual support, he later exhibits paranoia, self-centered decision-making, and cruelty. Events like his revenge killing of Angelo Brontë shock even loyal followers like Arthur and John, who start to see Dutch's actions as increasingly detached from his supposed ideals. Dutch begins to justify violence on the flimsiest of premises, not to protect the gang or further their collective dream, but to assert control and defend his image of himself. This transformation highlights a key theme. Dutch's philosophy wasn't a stable ideology so much as a romantic construct that could only function when things were going well. Once faced with persistent failure and the reality that his grand vision couldn't be achieved, Dutch's philosophical rhetoric collapses and is replaced by ego, denial, and destructive compulsions. He stops trying to build a future and instead tries to maintain an illusion of greatness, even if it costs the lives of those who once believed in him. The result is tragic. Dutch doesn't simply lose a battle, he loses the very principles that once gave him influence. His descent from charismatic philosopher leader to erratic and dangerous figure speaks to the fragility of ideals unmoored from reality, and the danger of leadership built on personality rather than substance. What starts as a compelling pushback against a changing world ends in a desperate grasp for validation, ultimately destroying the community he once inspired and leaving behind a cautionary tale about the cost of clinging to dreams that the world has already outgrown. The brief alliance between Dutch van der Linde and Catherine Braithwaite in Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the clearest examples of Dutch being outplayed by someone who understands power better than he does. This isn't a story about guns or territory. It's about ego, manipulation, and two leaders who believe they are the smartest person in the room. The difference is that Catherine Braithwaite actually is. When Dutch first approaches the Braithwaites, he treats them like backward Southern aristocrats clinging to a dying legacy. He assumes their wealth, their manners, and their plantation lifestyle make them predictable. Catherine immediately sees through him. She recognizes Dutch as a drifter with big ideas, not a true power broker. From the start, she plays into his self-image. The charming outlaw revolutionary who believes he can pit powerful families against each other and walk away clean. Catherine never challenges that illusion. She encourages it. What makes Catherine dangerous is her patience. She doesn't rush Dutch or threaten him outright. Instead, she gives him just enough trust to keep him useful. She lets the Van der Linde gang run errands, sabotage the Greys, steal information, and create chaos, all while maintaining plausible deniability. Dutch believes he's exploiting an old family feud for profit. In reality, Catherine is letting outsiders do the dirty work her family can't afford to be seen doing. Dutch confuses activity with control, and Catherine uses that against him. The turning point is when Catherine allows Jack Marston to be kidnapped. This moment exposes the core difference between her and Dutch. Dutch talks endlessly about loyalty and family, but Catherine practices ruthless pragmatism. To her, Jack is leverage, nothing more. She understands something Dutch doesn't want to admit. Ideals mean nothing when survival and legacy are on the line. By taking Jack, she asserts dominance not just over the gang, but over Dutch personally. She proves that she sees through his speeches and knows exactly where to hurt him. Dutch's response on the assault on Braithwaite Manor feels decisive and powerful, but it's actually reactive. Catherine has already won by this point. She forces Dutch into open violence, exposing the gang, escalating their notoriety, and pushing them further down a path they can't come back from. Even though Catherine is killed in the attack, her final act succeeds. She destabilizes the gang emotionally and strategically, and she accelerates Dutch's unraveling. This is one of the first moments where Dutch abandons long-term thinking in favor of emotional vengeance. What's especially important is how Dutch never acknowledges that he was manipulated. He frames the destruction of the Braithwaites as justice, as liberation, as necessary. Catherine, even in defeat, never grants him that narrative victory. She dies defiant, mocking, and unrepentant, fully aware that Dutch's win is hollow. Her legacy, for all its cruelty, outlasts her. Dutch's certainty does not. This encounter marks a shift in Dutch's character. After Catherine Braithwaite, Dutch becomes more paranoid, more impulsive, and more obsessed with control. He stops underestimating enemies, but he never learns to question himself. Catherine doesn't just challenge Dutch physically, she exposes the flaw that ultimately destroys him. Dutch van der Linde's relationship with Sheriff Lee Gray in Red Dead Redemption 2 is a textbook example of how Dutch mistakes authority for respect and manipulation for partnership. This isn't a rivalry built on personal hatred. It's a slow-burning collapse caused by Dutch believing he can sit at the table with men who exist to eventually sell him out. Sheriff Gray represents local institutional power in Rhodes, and Dutch badly misreads how that power actually works. When the Van der Linde gang arrives in Rhodes, Dutch immediately shifts tactics. Instead of hiding from the law, he leans into it. Sheriff Gray isn't treated like an enemy, but like a potential ally. Dutch flatters him, jokes with him, drinks with him, and presents the gang as deputies, helping keep the peace during the Gray-Braithwaite feud. To Dutch, this feels like evolution. He's no longer just an outlaw. He's a man operating above the law by working alongside it. What he fails to understand is that Gray never stops seeing them as expendable outsiders. Sheriff Gray uses Dutch the same way Catherine Braithwaite does, but with a badge instead of a plantation. He feeds the gang selective information, sends them on errands that weaken his enemies, and keeps his own hands clean. The difference is that Gray doesn't even pretend there's a long-term arrangement. His authority comes from the state, not from trust. And once the gang has outlived its usefulness, he plans to erase them. Dutch interprets Gray's friendliness as respect. In reality, it's containment. The turning point comes during a short walk in a pretty town. The gang walks into what they believe is another routine meeting, still convinced they're in control. Instead, it's a setup. Gray's men ambush them in the street, and Sean McGuire is killed instantly, shot without warning. This moment is crucial for Dutch's character. It's one of the first times his confidence gets someone he cares about killed in broad daylight. Not during a robbery, not during a grand plan, but because he trusted the wrong kind of authority. After the ambush, the confrontation with Sheriff Gray becomes brutally direct. The illusion of cooperation collapses, and Rhodes descends into chaos. Gray is killed during the violent fallout, but there's no satisfaction in it. Dutch doesn't outsmart him. He doesn't expose corruption, he just survives. And that distinction matters. Dutch frames the event as a betrayal, but it's actually inevitability. Gray was always going to turn on them. Dutch simply ignored every warning sign because he wanted legitimacy without accountability. What makes Sheriff Gray so important to Dutch's arc is that he represents a version of power Dutch wants but can never have. Gray wears authority openly. Dutch has to perform it. When Gray betrays him, it reinforces Dutch's growing paranoia and deepens his belief that the world is conspiring against him, rather than forcing him to confront his own misjudgment. Instead of learning restraint, Dutch doubles down on control. After Rhodes, Dutch stops pretending the law can be negotiated with. He becomes more violent, more reactive, and more convinced that betrayal is everywhere. Sheriff Gray doesn't just kill Sean, like he kills Dutch's last illusion that he can play both outlaw and statesman. From that point on, Dutch stops trying to coexist with civilization and starts waging war against it, convinced that force is the only language anyone truly understands. Dutch van der Linde's relationship with Angelo Brontë in Red Dead Redemption 2 is the most brutal reality check Dutch ever receives, because Brontë exposes the lie at the center of Dutch's identity, that charisma and ideology can substitute for real power. This isn't a clash of criminals, it's a collision between an outlaw who thinks he understands civilization and a man who actually owns part of it. When Dutch enters St. Denis, he believes he's adapting. He dresses better, speaks softer, and convinces himself he's evolving beyond robberies and camps into something more refined. Angelo Brontë is the embodiment of what Dutch thinks he's becoming. Brontë is calm, wealthy, politically connected, and insulated from consequences. He doesn't run from the law that he hosted at dinner. Dutch sees Brontë as a potential equal, someone who operates above the chaos. What Dutch fails to understand is that Brontë doesn't see equals, he sees assets. From their first meeting, Brontë is clearly amused by Dutch. He listens politely, offers small opportunities, and feeds Dutch just enough success to keep him cooperative. Jobs like tracking the street kids or helping retrieve stolen goods aren't real partnerships, they're tests. Brontë is measuring how desperate Dutch is, how easily he can be flattered, and how far he can be pushed. Dutch interprets this as respect. Arthur notably does not. Arthur senses immediately that Brontë is smiling because he's already won. The street kids incident is especially revealing. Brontë knowingly sets Dutch up to be humiliated, allowing the boys to rob him and escape. This isn't accidental, it's Brontë asserting dominance without violence. He's showing Dutch that St. Denis isn't the frontier and brute force isn't the currency here. Control is. Dutch laughs it off publicly, but privately it eats at him. His authority depends on being the smartest man in the room, and Brontë strips that away effortlessly. What truly breaks Dutch is realizing that Brontë has no intention of letting the gang rise. The trolley station robbery proves it. Brontë gives Dutch bad information, knowing it will lead to disaster. Law enforcement swarms the area, civilians die, and the gang barely escapes. Brontë doesn't need Dutch dead. He needs him gone. Dutch has outlived his usefulness, and Brontë removes him the same way he removes any inconvenience. Indirectly, cleanly, and without risk. Dutch's response to this betrayal is telling. He doesn't accept that he was manipulated. He reframes it as a personal insult that must be avenged. The kidnapping of Brontë isn't strategic. It's emotional. Dutch drags him through the swamp not to extract information, but to reclaim his wounded pride. Bronte's final moments are devastating, because even then he doesn't take Dutch seriously. He mocks him, laughs at his ideals, and calls him exactly what he is. A man pretending to be important in a world that has already moved on. When Dutch feeds Brontë to the alligator, it's one of the most disturbing moments in the game. Not because of the violence, but because of what it reveals. This isn't justice or survival. It's denial. Dutch kills Brontë to silence the truth Brontë represents. That Dutch's philosophy has no place in modern America. Civilization didn't corrupt Dutch's dream. It rendered it irrelevant. After Brontë, Dutch fundamentally changes. He stops trying to integrate with society and starts openly rejecting it. Saint Denis marks the end of Dutch's illusion that he can outthink the system. From that point on, every plan becomes louder, bloodier, and less coherent. Brontë doesn't just defeat Dutch, he accelerates his collapse by proving that intelligence without humility becomes arrogance, and ideology without adaptability becomes madness. Angelo Brontë is the first man Dutch meets who cannot be intimidated, inspired, or outsmarted. And because Dutch cannot accept that, he chooses destruction instead. In that sense, Brontë's true victory isn't his survival. It's the fact that Dutch leaves St. Denis broken, exposed, and closer than ever to becoming exactly what he claims to hate. And that's the tragedy of it. Brontë never needed to kill Dutch, because the damage was already done. By showing Dutch how small he really was in the modern world, Brontë shattered the last version of Dutch that believed he could still win on intellect alone. From that moment forward, Dutch stops learning and starts reacting. And every failure after St. Denis traces back to that single realization he can't face. Dutch van der Linde's conflict with Leviticus Cornwall in Red Dead Redemption 2 is the clearest illustration of the game's central argument. The outlaw age didn't end because of morality or law, but because industrial power made men like Dutch obsolete. This isn't a personal feud born from insult or betrayal. It's a collision between two worldviews that cannot coexist, and Dutch never truly understands how badly he's already lost. Leviticus Cornwall is not a lawman, and he's not a criminal in the traditional sense. He is capital. Railroads, oil, factories, private security, and political influence all flow through him. When Dutch robs Cornwall's train early in the story, he treats it like a symbolic victory, stealing from a rich tyrant to fund freedom. What he doesn't grasp is that Cornwall doesn't experience robbery as defeat. For men like Cornwall, loss is temporary, and retaliation is systematic. Cornwall's response is immediate and impersonal. He hires the Pinkerton Detective Agency, not to negotiate or intimidate, but to erase the problem entirely. This marks a shift in the game's tone. Until Cornwall, the gang is fighting sheriffs, rival outlaws, and local authority. Cornwall introduces something far more dangerous, a man who can weaponize the law, the economy, and private violence all at once. Dutch still believes charisma and planning can outmaneuver that kind of power. They can't. Every subsequent encounter between Dutch and Cornwall escalates the imbalance. Dutch frames Cornwall as a villain oppressing workers and the poor, but Cornwall never engages with Dutch on ideological terms. He doesn't debate freedom or fairness, he simply applies pressure. Camps are discovered faster, safe havens disappear, resources dry up. Dutch interprets this as persecution. In reality, it's containment. The confrontation in Valentine is especially revealing. When Cornwall confronts the gang in public, flanked by armed guards, he doesn't threaten them, he informs them. He makes it clear that their resistance is inconvenient, not dangerous. Dutch responds with violence, killing Cornwall in cold blood. To Dutch, this feels like a triumph, a revolutionary act against tyranny. But narratively, it's the moment he seals the gang's fate. Cornwall's death doesn't weaken the system he represents. It strengthens it. The Pinkertons intensify their pursuit, now fully legitimized by the murder of a powerful industrialist. Dutch believes he's struck a blow against civilization. In reality, he's removed the last chance of being ignored. From this point forward, the gang is no longer a nuisance. They are a priority. What makes this conflict tragic is that Cornwall never needs to change tactics. Dutch does all the work for him. By escalating violence, rejecting compromise, and refusing to adapt, Dutch validates every justification used to destroy outlaws. Cornwall doesn't defeat Dutch through superior morality or bravery. He defeats him through infrastructure, bureaucracy, and scale. Dutch fights like it's still the frontier. Cornwall fights like it's the modern world. Arthur sees this long before Dutch does. Arthur understands that killing Cornwall doesn't stop the trains, the oil fields, or the Pinkertons. It only proves how outmatched they are. Dutch, however, clings to the fantasy that removing the man removes the problem. This inability to distinguish between symbols and systems is Dutch's fatal flaw. In the end, Leviticus Cornwall doesn't need to survive to win. His world does. Railroads expand, industry grows, and private enforcement replaces personal justice. Dutch's dream of freedom collapses not because it's wrong, but because it's outdated. Cornwall represents the future. Cold, efficient, and unstoppable. And Dutch, for all his fire and conviction, never truly stands a chance against something that doesn't care what he believes. And that's the final irony of their conflict. Dutch spends the entire game railing against men like Cornwall, believing they've stolen freedom from people like him. But Cornwall doesn't steal freedom. He redefines power so completely that freedom becomes irrelevant. By the time Dutch realizes this, it's far too late. Every plan becomes louder, bloodier, and more desperate, because Dutch is no longer fighting to win. He's fighting to prove that he still matters in a world that has already moved on without him. Beyond the immediate conflicts over trains and shipments, Dutch's feud with Cornwall also symbolizes the broader struggle between the fading outlaw era and the rise of industrial capitalism. Cornwall's relentless pursuit of profit, Arthur Morgan and Dutch van der Linde's relationship in Red Dead Redemption 2, is the emotional spine of the entire story. And what makes it so powerful is how complete it feels, from hope to doubt to heartbreak. Arthur doesn't just work for Dutch, he was shaped by him. After losing his parents at a young age, Arthur was taken in by Dutch and Hosea, and for years they were the only family he knew. Dutch taught Arthur how to read, how to think critically, and how to believe that outlaws weren't just criminals, but men standing against a corrupt world. Arthur grows up believing Dutch is a visionary, someone smarter and more principled than the people chasing them, and that belief becomes part of Arthur's identity. At the beginning of the game, Arthur's loyalty to Dutch is absolute. Even after the disastrous Blackwater robbery, Arthur never questions Dutch's role in it. He assumes something went wrong, that the plan failed because of bad luck or betrayal, not because Dutch miscalculated or acted recklessly. Arthur defends Dutch constantly, both to the gang and to himself. He believes that if they just survive long enough, Dutch will lead them to freedom, just like he always promised. This blind faith is important because it shows Arthur isn't stupid or naive. He's emotionally invested. Dutch didn't just give him a purpose, he gave him a way to justify the violence Arthur has committed his whole life. As the story progresses, Arthur begins noticing small but unsettling changes. Dutch starts talking more about faith and loyalty, demanding belief instead of earning it. Plans become louder, messier, and more public. The gang stops laying low even though staying hidden was once Dutch's golden rule. Arthur voices concerns gently at first. He asks questions. He reminds Dutch of the old ways. He brings up Hosea's advice. These moments matter because Arthur isn't challenging Dutch's authority. He's trying to save him from himself. Arthur still wants Dutch to be the man he remembers. Hosea's death is a turning point that can't be overstated. Hosea was the only person Dutch truly listened to, and without him, Dutch spirals fast. Arthur feels this loss deeply, not just emotionally, but structurally. The balance is gone. Micah fills that void, feeding Dutch's paranoia, encouraging brutality, and validating every bad instinct Dutch has. Arthur immediately senses Micah is poison, but Dutch starts trusting Micah more than the man he practically raised. That betrayal hurts Arthur more than any insult ever could. By Chapter 6, the relationship is beyond repair. Arthur is sick, exhausted, and finally honest with himself. He realizes Dutch doesn't want freedom anymore. He wants control, legacy, and obedience. Dutch stops seeing Arthur as a son and starts seeing him as a liability. Arthur's compassion, especially toward John, Abigail, and innocent people, becomes proof to Dutch that Arthur has lost faith. In reality, Arthur has found clarity. Tuberculosis forces Arthur to confront his life, and instead of clinging to false hope, he chooses responsibility. He starts undoing the damage where he can, even if it means turning against the man he once worshipped. Their final confrontations are devastating because Arthur never truly stops caring. He doesn't scream at Dutch out of hatred. He speaks to him like someone begging to be understood. Arthur calls out Micah, warns Dutch, and even at the very end, he gives Dutch one last chance to see the truth. When Arthur says he gave Dutch everything he had, that isn't exaggeration. Arthur gave him loyalty, violence, silence, belief, and his youth. Dutch's failure isn't that he lost, it's that he refused to listen when it mattered most. Arthur's death is the final fracture. Dutch walks away, unable to pull the trigger. Dutch van der Linde's betrayal of Arthur Morgan is one of the most painful and defining moments in Red Dead Redemption 2. It's not just the betrayal of a friend, it's the collapse of everything the van der Linde gang once stood for. To understand why Dutch turned on Arthur, you have to look at how their relationship began, and how Dutch's mind slowly unraveled over time. Arthur wasn't just another gang member, he was Dutch's protege. Dutch raised him like a son after finding him lost and angry at a young age. Hosea, Dutch, and Arthur formed the heart of the gang, with Dutch always claiming that Arthur was his rock. Arthur believed in Dutch's vision completely. For years he followed him without question, convinced that Dutch's talk of freedom and loyalty was genuine. But as the years went on, the cracks in Dutch's philosophy began to show, and when Red Dead Redemption 2 begins, those cracks are becoming impossible to ignore. The turning point comes after the botched ferry job in Blackwater. The gang is on the run, people are starving, and Dutch's confidence begins to slip. Arthur stays loyal, but he starts noticing Dutch making decisions that don't fit the man he used to know. Killing people unnecessarily, trusting the wrong allies, and refusing to listen to reason. Hosea and Arthur both start to see that Dutch's plans are getting people killed. Then comes Micah Bell. Micah enters the gang as a late addition, brash, violent, and manipulative. But he tells Dutch exactly what he wants to hear. He flatters Dutch, feeds his ego, and turns him against the people who question him. When Arthur starts to challenge Dutch's decisions, Micah whispers that Arthur's gone soft. Instead of trusting the man who's been by his side for decades, Dutch chooses to believe the snake in his ear. Arthur's illness only makes things worse. When he learns he's dying, Arthur begins to see life, and Dutch, more clearly. He realizes the gang isn't about freedom anymore, it's about Dutch's pride. He tries to pull Dutch back to reality, urging him to save John and Abigail and get out while they can. But Dutch refuses. He's too far gone. He tells Arthur to have faith, even as his plans fall apart and his people die around him. The moment of true betrayal happens during the confrontation on the mountain. Arthur tries to expose Micah as the rat, but Dutch won't listen. Even after seeing Micah and Arthur fight to the death, Dutch walks away. From Arthur, from John, from the truth. He doesn't kill Arthur himself, but his inaction speaks louder than any bullet. He chooses pride over loyalty, ego over love, and leaves the man who once called him father to die alone. Dutch's betrayal of Arthur isn't about hate. It's about weakness. Deep down, Dutch can't face what he's become. He knows Arthur's right, but admitting it would mean admitting that everything he's built, everything he's sacrificed was for nothing. So, instead, he walks away. When Dutch kills Micah years later at the end of the game, it's not redemption, it's guilt. A quiet acknowledgement that Arthur was right all along. Dutch doesn't say a word, because there's nothing left to say. He betrayed the one person who truly believed in him, and it cost him everything. In the end, Dutch's betrayal of Arthur isn't just the breaking of trust. It's the death of the man Dutch used to be. Arthur was his conscience, and when Dutch turned his back on him, he lost the last piece of himself that was still good.